Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Okay, let us start our afternoon session. Beginning with, we'll have two papers and then a break and then two papers, so we have to have and then a break and then the last two. So beginning with Professor Elsner, who's going to tell us about the big alpha synagogue.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Now, we've had a morning where we've looked at, in some ways or others, or other different kinds of fragments. Rick had one poem, the last poem, out of a whole lot of them. Wendy kind of almost gave us a whole book, selected down. In other words, the problematics of how much you deliver the fragment and what, and of course Margaret actually had a fragment. Well, here we've got, what should I show you? How much should I... first of all, we have a problem of photographs. This is a terrible photograph because it's cut off quite a lot of what's there. Is this better? Should I give you that? Or maybe... Ooh, terrible slide, but you get the whole thing. Or maybe that's the right way around. I mean, how do you deal with a fragment? And that's one thing is the fragment that we take out of the finished text. But another thing is what we're given. This is all that survives of the synagogue from the 6th century. And even to put this up on the screen, first of all, whose view is this? A God's eye view. I mean, who would ever... And secondly, I suppose, who is it that walks into a room and looks at the floor? What is the status of the floor? And we don't have anything else. We do not have the walls, we don't have the ceiling, we don't have any of the stuff that was inside. So even before we start, the question, and so imagine this is my document for teaching religion, and I put this in front of a group of first year students. How much packaging does it need? Not, forget religion. How much packaging or kind of material explanation and kind, and also worrying about that, and do we need before we even begin to talk about anything? And it seems to me that that's, and the fact that if it's because it's a floor, depending on where you stand, that is not an incorrect image, or even upside down, because floors are like that. So there are lots of kind of, and indeed, this image performs the possibility of different, although obviously there is a way in which that says this is the viewpoint, it's not wholly normative about that viewpoint. And that's instantiated also in a way that it plays itself around in a Greek inscription and an Aramaic inscription. So either it's bilingual or it can't decide. And it's got inscriptions that are not, that go round in the zodiac and that are not in the dimension of the quotes correct viewing of the floor. So even before we start, we've got something that could be. If I publish this in a book, then it's that way. But actually, we should be doing this with it, and we ought to be at least imaginatively walking around it. And we ought also imaginatively not to be looking at it at all, because it's the least important thing in the building of which nothing else survived. So that's a kind of preface to the problem of a kind of archaeological material culture in relation to religion. One thing is the selections we make, which are also the selections history has made in terms of what matters. And my example of this is always history of Greek, ancient Greek literature, which has been selected for us very carefully by the Byzantines. What was uninteresting to the Byzantines did not survive. objects. Yes, the design had selected them, and they stuffed Constantinople with them, and none of them survived. So what survives is the junk they weren't interested in. In other words, what would survive, the equivalent of our material culture from antiquity is, on the literary side, would be what was found in the papyrus dumps of Oxyrhynchus. We would not have a discipline classic if it had been the same parallel. So there's a very interesting, problematic, kind of methodological starting point. Now, is any of this about religion? Well, in some ways it is, because of course all those selections are about religion in some way. And that's just a preface to a problem. And I have a particular problem, which is I don't know how normative or non-normative it is to try to teach religion out of just this. In other words, dump the text. There are a few texts here, but they're not particularly. They tell us the names of the artists, and they tell us that there was a congregation at this time during the reign of the 6th century Byzantine emperor, which put the thing up. So they are texts that are relatively unuseful for the study of religion. Now, beyond that, we have a whole other nightmare story, which is the history of excavation. What we know, there's a Protestant truth, I mean, it's a universal truth, that there's no such thing as Jewish art, because it says in the Bible, we do have great images. And what's more, there was no Jewish art from antiquity until the early 1920s. So the rise of Jewish art took place with the rise of excavation in Palestine. So here's the story of this synagogue. This is actually, although it's the latest of our great synagogue floors, it's actually the first one that was discovered. Discovered by, and I've said Palestine, I've not said Israel because it was Palestine, discovered by socialists in a kibbutz who were digging for water. Then they brought in Eleazar Synagogue, who is the great founder of Jewish archaeology, who digs it up and publishes it. And that act, Synagogue, is intensely zealous as an archaeologist. His son, the Yigal Yadin, Begins deputy minister, the excavator in Masada. You can't get more kind of, and Yadin, of course, the head of the Israeli Defense Force during the war, the Independence War. You can't get more intimate. Now, no politics, and yet the object exists in an intensely political climate in which it has to be said that it is a claim for territory. It's proof. It's a type of view. That's a problem. Although it's a problem that is more or less suppressed, should we talk about that in the study of religion? Yes and no. I mean, is it relevant? I don't know. But it's a problem. As a kind of starting point. And of course, it's one of a whole cycle of these things. And the question then is, if we were to teach it, how do we frame it? Do we frame it with the literature that exists? And what do you think literature? Who do you think bothered to write about this stuff? There's only one kind of literature, and of course it's all Israeli apologetic. That's heavily problematic. So what does the Israeli apologetic literature do? Well, it first of all emphasizes that there was such a thing as Jewish art in Palestine that was distinctive and special. And it tells you all kinds of stories about how that is quite sophisticated because it's playing with all kinds of motifs in the early tradition, and that it's self-differentiated from Christian hegemony, and so on and so forth. And those stories are untrue, but they're true, they're angled in their truth. So again, I don't know where we start, if there is a place to start that is on a blank surface, but there's a whole problematic there. And none of this is anywhere near our image. We haven't got there yet. If we were to get there, well, of course, the stories are really interesting. This has got people. So that's exciting if you don't believe there should be people in Jewish art. And it's, what's more, a classic story. So it's a narrative, that is to say, Abraham sacrificing the young Isaac. It's very crude, very poor. Quotation marks for everything. So therefore it's late. Well, it is late. It's dated itself late. and it's proof of a kind of general decline, and you've got more sophisticated Jewish artists earlier, and so we can do a whole game about dating and so on, where it fits a kind of narrative of style and one thing another. So one thing we have is a narrative here. Second thing we've got is a lot of Jewish paraphernalia, which we're told is determinative of, quote, Jewish art. And it is true that such art as has been called Jewish is called Jewish because it's got a load of Jewish paraphernalia. If Christians use Jewish paraphernalia, we'd be in trouble. But we don't have to ask that question because we just want it to be Jewish art. But clearly, but the one thing that's interesting, of course, the 6th century, these two images, if you think of them as sight, points to a site, or an absence, which is to say, the temple. This, mythically speaking, this is one of the establishing events at the temple on Mount Moriah. This is the temple, some kind of depiction of something that might be the Ark of the Covenant. There are always lions there, which are described in the text there, and of course so on. So, do we have a framing around the temple? But if the temple is the beginning and the end of this, and of course now I'm way beyond, already interpretatively beyond most of where the literature's gone, which is very, very, doesn't like to do this kind of thing, because its claims are secularist, Zionist, apologetic. They're not religious. Although it's a synagogue, but the synagogue is a claim on the land. And you see the difficulty in terms of the literature, in terms of dealing with this kind of material, in what is in fact a polemical discourse, pretending to be an academic discourse. In the middle, we've got something that's really awkward. That is to say, Helios, we're always told, in a zodiac, surrounded by the seasons. Sometimes the seasons are the four winds. Now, that's not wholly unnormative model for piles of ancient religion, for Mosaic clause and so on. In Judaism, well, then we have all these stories about the assimilation of various forms of Hellenism and so forth. Only in the in the 2000s have people begun to have, to even gesture towards something that was anathema to the secularist archaeological interpretations of the first half of the 20th century, the possible idea that there might even be a Jewish literature of the period. I mean, I'm thinking of Kabbalah mysticism, I'm thinking an amazingly rich, vibrant literature that might even make some sense of it. But it's extraordinary. I mean, there's an article by Jody Magnus of 2005, which is the first that actually attempts to make the case. Now so all I'm saying is how difficult the situation is, even to begin. Now, having laid out all my various anxieties, how then, I'm going to put you the question, I don't have the answer. How do I, if I'm going to teach this, how would I teach this as a document in the study group? And I have a kind of conviction that if we are to get to any kind of late antique Judaism, well, it's not totally trivial that they had Mosaic laws. It's not totally relevant that their synagogues are liturgical spaces in which these kinds of actually rather intelligent designs, in the least important part of the building, have some kind of significance, and indeed may have, but we can't know this, may have defined elements of the liturgical space. They may have ritual significance in their own right. We can't know. If you stuck the Ark of the Covenant on top of this, it would be an interesting kind of statement. But we don't know. So, there's my point. I'm in your house. So, can I ask a question? If you're going to ask us that question, can you tell us why at least you want to teach it in an introductory class? So we can... That's a question mark too, because I don't know. I was asked if an object. And the thing, well, because before we get there, we have the question is: should art, material culture, be part of the... I mean,
yes.
Is religion textual? If it's not textual, so once we move, if you were to grant me that religion cannot just be textual, then the misfortune of that is that it opens this terrible door, and all this kind of rubbish starts flowing through, and it is a mess. Or we can choose our very particular, specific object that will work, but that's cheating, because it's not true for the morass of, especially this kind of object, which are a bit like Marty's objects, just junk reinvented, I mean, in a whole new packaging. So that's, if you like, but it's a pragmatic answer. I mean, why did I choose this? Because it's sophisticated and interesting as an example of its genre, and in relatively better material condition than a number of the others that would be equivalent. But of course I could have chosen something Christian. But if I'd done that, we'd have been on easier territory because it's more familiar. Because there's been a series of scholarly discourses that have done Christianity as a religion through material culture for over a century. But it's not, they haven't done that for Judaism. And that's, of course, worse but better. Or better than, yeah. Yes?
I was just curious about how an inclusion of material culture allows for more pollution, more corruption than only focusing on text. Could not someone also say that focusing on texts opens the possibility of plenty of texts that don't fit or would be distracting?
I certainly wouldn't want to deny the ability of text to be polluted. To pollute. So,
shows there. I mean, that seems polluting.
No, it's just that this stuff is really... At least we have methods of dealing with texts in relation to religion. Whereas I think we're very underdeveloped in thinking about how we deal with visual and material culture. And with, for example, the problematic of bittiness. Yes.
So I once read this article by this guy named Elsner about the Dura Synagogue that argues that, among other things, some of the, and this is from 256, so considerably earlier, and there you're willing to make an argument about certain forms of polemics, vis-a-vis the Palmyrene gods, vis-a-vis the Durian gods, etc. So if I can ask that other Elsner to look at this one, and are there polemics, or in fact, is it really assimilationist, which is a word that's often used, right? So, because the Zodiac is, of course, the classic Greco-Roman pantheon, or certainly way of mapping the skies. So,
well, if I spoke to that person, they might say to me, first of all, with Dura, we have the great advantage of multiple other sites or other buildings in the same context that have iconography that we can speak with. So I think polemic it's not merely a hypothetical model we would apply, but it is one that has contextual and historical justification within the place. It's still more of an interpretation than someone would make. But in this case, of course, it is absolutely plausible to apply both possible simulation. If that other person were answering, what I think they would say is that one ought to be able to read it both ways. And it's interesting to be able to read, to say, well, there could be a very strong kind of macabre Jewish type reading with the heavenly chariot and all kinds of things, and a cosmological reading that places the lost temple, the absence, in nevertheless a kind of universal stuff. You could do that. And I haven't done the work. Indeed, it would be hard for me to do the work, and I don't have Hebrew. But one could do the work, and one could find. Without any doubt, I would put my money that you could find texts that would support that. But it would always be a hypothesis reading, although I think it's impossible to deny the certainty that somebody with that kind of point of view would have access to this kind of thing. On the other hand, the assimilations model is also viable. That is, so it speaks in many ways. It is already capacious, and that's part of the effect of iconography, and part of the problematic of the normative still quite positive kinds of conjunctive literature, which want a single truth or a kind of answer. This is a depiction of the temple, this kind of answer, which is, in my way of thinking, useless, because there's a spectrum of possibilities. But what we can't do, and that's one reason I chose this, because its isolation, as it were, means we cannot have any contextualist support in the way we have with Dura. Although, of course, we know something about the context of Jews. I mean, we know all kinds of historical frames, but those are historical frames that we have to then. I mean, you have to make a load of jumps, which make this a what-if object. But perhaps that's all what it can be. Yeah.
Just thinking about teaching it in the introductory course, I have an idea. You asked us for ideas on how to teach this. What about beginning by soliciting questions? What questions does this pose to the students in the class? Precisely with the opacity on the one hand and communicability on the other hand of precisely what we have. What do you want to know about the subject? First, what do you want to know about the subject? Then maybe which of those questions does it seem to suggest an answer or indicate an answer? To whom might those answers matter? And what else do we need in order to adjudicate between them? And so hopefully you have a student who says, well, this is all, this is just the floor, what about the walls? And now you're off, now you have the opportunity to move in that direction. Or really any question that they might have about the floor, no matter how sort of open-ended or vague, is, I think, part of the problematic you set up at the beginning.
I'm happy with that. There are certain things that students will tend not to jump to. They'll tend not to look at the dates 1928 and 1929 and place those in a historical moment and make the necessary and complex assumptions or entailments about, in a way, the historical kind of, the political resonance in modernity of this kind of moment. I mean, this has another resonance. 1929, there's another moment in Germany for whom this proved a kind of decadence. During Europe, is 1932. It's perfect. And was so used. So it went two ways. Yes, and then.
Yeah, I'm sort of on this same note. The other context to bring in is what students are already expecting when they come to an image like this, so that it seems to me there are a couple of different ways you could pitch it. Maybe ask students to bring in an image, a religious image, and talk a little bit about what makes this a religious image, and then put this up and ask them what makes that a religious image. Yeah. Or to ask them to do what is a sacred space, and then show them this and say, what makes this part of the sacred space. So I think it's the same thing to generate questions, but to have them also articulate at any time what they think is going on.
But a religious image, the game of religious images is whether that can be constitute the basis for a discussion of what religion is. There's this, it's very easy to read anything you want into an image. The answers given in those texts, that's the textual problem. How do we do it the other way? How do we actually try to construct a model of religion which is sympathetic to the forms of argument, if that's the right word for it, that images, material culture in their own right construct? And that's difficult. I mean, I think it's difficult in any respect. But I do think it sort of matters for... I mean, most religion articulates itself in some ways materially. And that is sort of easy to forget.
So how do we know that the floor is the least important part?
I'm being outrageous. There's no... Absolutely. But still, I felt I had to do that. But I know there's no way we can know.
Just a comment about that. I'm not sure I'd tell them it's a floor. I'd be tempted to leave that open just in terms of puzzling about it, because I think when you realize it's a floor, that's interesting. I want to talk about something else that's sort of a question in response to your question as I take it, and you were getting at this in your answer to Ms. Gray's question, and that's the status of the word text here. And I guess what I want to suggest, and I'm really happy to hear you dispute this. I mean, I'm with you completely on the point that religion's communication is obviously not merely written or verbal, and that there's a propensity to underestimate the degree to which it's not, and that attention to visual culture is a great way to begin to remedy that. I'm totally with that. You're talking about this, though, as if it's a text, and I think you're right to do so, in the sense that a text is something that we identify as holding meaning and being discursive and an object in some way of interpretation. So I'm wondering if the word text doesn't complicate the matter of can I teach this in an introductory course needlessly, in the sense that you can make the point you want to make about the material communication of religion, and then acknowledge that anything we stipulate is selective. This gets to the concept question Sarah was asking vis-a-vis sources in some way, I think. And this is your text, not in the sense that it's written, but that you've stipulated it as something that is meaningful and analyzable and contextualizable in some way that's helpful, and also partial, right? So that the obligation is to recognize all those things. I mean, are there things about that go against the grain of how you'd like to think about it, or not?
The problem is that my discussion of it as a text was, my interpretation of it was indeed textual and discursive and scandalous. That is to say, it succumbed to all the crimes that have been tried to.
So you really should. Okay, go ahead.
Why? Because, in a sense, I find text to explain the eyes of the scene, and I can then make a kind of textual synthetics. But if what really matters, and we can't, the thing is, it's all about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, and
oh my God,
isn't it all?
Isn't it all? But you see, what we don't know is what these divisions mean.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what matters.
Yeah.
But we don't know anything. So we can tell something, but why is the iconography important? That's our shtick. The iconography could be much less important than, and this frame, which wonderfully, actually, they failed to illustrate properly, which, I mean, that in a sense, maybe that means where the congregation can be, and that would make a difference. All these, so the problem is, how can we make make this work? Why is there a field here, this strange empty, which isn't the same here? How can we make this work in evoking, if you like, liturgical or ritual realities, and the evocation of ritual realities in the visual culture, indeed of sacrificial? This is the sacrifice that shouldn't have happened, that then was replaced, that never happened, that doesn't happen anymore, lots of very weird and actually quite interesting things in operation. Very difficult to do that, though. So my earlier exegesis was terrible. That is to say, it was the easy one could do. But where the thing could be made, would need to be made to work, is precisely against the grain and in ways that the scriptures, texts, exegeses of the normative kind don't do. That would be my idea. But of course, I'm asking too much. We always ask too much, right? That's the other thing. We always ask too much about poor little images.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, and I don't know if this is useful or at all, but I mean, it's not a Christian image, but it's also not a Christian image, because I mean, I've got the Church of San Isidoro in Leon has Abraham and Isaac in two different places. It has the zodiac, and it has a Bible in it that has a tabernacle. It's just like this, and the curtains and everything.
Yeah. So then you have this, and this is of course huge and very difficult, because it's, again, politics doesn't let you do it. How subaltern is it? Yeah. And here we have really interesting issues, I think, about late ancient Judaism, which is in certain sense models itself on on the normative culture, but with some differentiation. So here we have a kind of Christian church. And who knows who the artists? In Dura, there's no doubt at all the tiles of the synagogue are made by the same people who make tiles of other houses, which are almost certainly not occupied by Jews. That is to say, the job not of tiles, or whatever. So I do think that there's a question like that. And there's a very difficult question to start discussing because, of course, people have very strong views, especially in the context of Zionism and so forth. But I do not disagree with that proposition. Yes.
You said something about this artifacts having become, almost regardless of its original use and context, a political artifact, a political document, and a land claim in particular, and I presume you mean because of the modern political context in which it happens to have been recovered and stakes.
Well, in which every example of this kind has been recovered. So the whole of Jewish archaeology exists in that context, apart from this object.
My question is whether you can elaborate on the thought you have in pointing that out. I wonder, for example, whether you think that fact about it opens the way to understanding something about its intrinsic significance in context, whether that is revealing of something significant, or whether that's just the historically contingent and accidental point that it happens to have come to light again in what has, in the intervening years, become a differently complex historical political situation.
Well, I think I would veer more towards the contingent, but of course it's not contingent because it's the result of that politics, that thrust that then really made an archaeology out of it, and made archaeology so central. But the other side of that is that it is also it has made such a significant frame to the literature.
I guess part of maybe another way to put the question is that's largely a point about the contemporary context for scholarship about this this kind of thing. Is it at the same time a point about this as the historical artifact that it is, or is it only the former?
Well, but how do we know the artifact outside the context to which we have to look at it? So it's very difficult to get beyond that. I mean, but in principle, if one could be beyond that frame of literature in an ideal world, yes, I don't think it would have any particular bearing. But I just don't see how we can access any of these artifacts without that complexity of frame. And they're very insistent. The books are very insistent. And my friends who read Hebrew tell me they're even more insistent.
So one of the questions I had when I tried to pick something, so sort of like you, I sort of thought, I was asked to be part of this, what kind of thing would they want somebody like me to bring? But so I'm wondering about optimal felicitousness of what we would bring in. And one of the things you thought was helpful about this was that there's very little to go on. But for students, right, they're going to have very little to go on, almost irrespective of what you bring to them. But when they have little to go on, you'll be able then to use certain tools of critical inquiry and so forth that would help you draw something out of this other than just a sort of question, right? So I'd be interested in hearing. What's that?
I'm not sure about that, but maybe.
Well, okay. I mean, you could at least then talk a little bit more about probable reconstructions of what's going on here based on, we know a lot more about this context of this mosaic and so forth as opposed to this one, right? I think it would just be interesting for me to hear you talk more about why you would want to choose the one that we have less to go on.
That is certainly true, because I think that in a sense, they're more equal with me. But in the end, although I'm more enthusiastic, I've been doing this for 30 years, do it with my eyes closed or whatever, and can always come up with some plausible answer. The thing is, if I chose a Christian thing, then in the end as a literature, they can read, they can access, and then they can happily do it and talk the same old rubbish. But here, we don't have an answer. I don't have an answer, and there's no answer in literature. So, in a sense, we're all in the same boat. Yes, I've got more experience and skills, but apart from that, the boat's sort of holding it, we're all sinking. So I liked that about the problem. Because in the end, if they came up with something, they'll come up with something at the coalface of where we're at. That seems to me nice. So, in a sense, given that it's hopeless, we may as well drown together. Yes.
Another thing that is certainly not unattested, but is really striking about this mosaic are the animals.
Yes, lots.
How very animal-ish it is compared to what we might impose in the Bible and what we might know. And I don't know what to do with that, but it's just animals is one of the things that is mentioned in our new description of our intro course.
Well, and there is a kind of answer within the field. If you look at the floors of churches,
they're all full of.
They're all packed.
Beautiful.
Floors, ceiling, it's animals all over the place. Of course, here we have now some of the animals. Unfortunately, if I've been lucky, the Sukenik's monograph would have been on the shelf when I went to look for it for the last 2 days, but of course it wasn't. So I couldn't tell you what these are all stick animals. They're not. These are lions, by the way.
Sure.
Have any doubt.
And that's a lion.
That's a lion. Yeah. So that looks like a lion. What's that? A donkey? A buffalo?
It's a buffalo. Yeah.
Well, I wonder if that's what he says it is. But anyway, it is rich in animals. Animals are now, of course. The sacrificial potential of these animals is incredibly interesting, particularly in the context of there is no sacrifice. And that kind of performance of that as an imaginative possibility. There are certainly resonances to think about how that would work in the context of religion. And of course, the other thing about anything like this, which is in a liturgical space of some kind, is that, and here this comes back to text, depending on what text you perform, read, recite in it at any one time, its meanings will change. It's a theatre or a set, a stage set, and put Ezekiel in there, and obviously it has some resonances. Or put obviously the story of Abraham. Or any account of the temple. So actually it becomes, in that sense, it's a moving thing. And again, the animals will perform in that.
So it's versatile. So it's a machine for thinking. Very
versatile.
Yeah.
And that, of course, goes. That I would say a truth about the visual culture of religion. I wouldn't go so far into. I don't know enough about Buddhism or Hinduism, but certainly with Christianity, that's absolutely the case. You can't have any image in church is a part of the performance of the rituals that go on there. And that's a remarkable, you get to read the whole Bible at the time you're done through a whole year. As it were. But yes.
So do we know what mosaics in private homes look like? As you said, that this other synagogue you saw, you have the example of other private homes. Is there a difference like in imagery of what appears?
Yes, we have, of course, this is late. And I think we probably don't have any Jewish private homes at this period. The problem is that most of our Jewish the thing is the archaeology of Jewish homes is complicated. What determines whether it's a Jewish home is the presence of a mikveh. Now, how you decide what is a mikveh, but it is in the huge interest of those, here back to politics, who want to claim to make lots of mikvahs. That means that the mosaics that we have, usually from from like Sephirus, for example, which is more a 4th century whether they're really from Jewish homes. Sorry to get complicated, but that's the kind of difficulty that there are these problems. Nevertheless, these kinds of scenes, biblical scenes, do not normally occur in all, or what we decide were synagogues are synagogues because of the presence of this kind of imagery. So there's of course, we have a little bit of support that some of the, they don't say synagogue, but they say they were dedicated by a population, by a congregation. So that helps. But there is a support.
So what about other sorts of Jewish spaces? Is there differentiation that's occurred between a synagogue and Beit Midrash? And is there also distinct spaces for...
I don't think you can be so precise. And of course, why can't this be a Midrash?
Beit Midrash, and why can't it?
No, I don't. I mean, what they'll do is... what they'll do is, it's a horrible slide, I'm sorry, but it is, of course, a bigger space than the floor survives, so you can always supply all the extras insofar as you want. I mean, that's available. And that's what people do. But archaeologists don't, it's truly terrible. I mean, it's a game. So.
It looks so much like a carpet in the other...
Yeah. They are really.
Yeah. So then the question is also, what stakes do the decorative have? If it's decorative.
Huge issue, and it's of course a particularly huge issue in the decorative religions. That is to say, Islam and Judaism, and that decorativeness, which is a profound dismissal. If you have a normative figural tradition, is directed, is negative against Judaism and Christianity, or for example, if decorative means uniconic, then in a Protestant tradition which includes Catholic, for example, which explicitly says somewhere, then of course they're much better. There's a double play.
Yeah, and for Christian art, anything we don't understand becomes decorative. Once we understand it, then it's no longer decorative.
I'm not interested in that.
I was compelled by your answer to my question about text, and it prompted another one, I guess. Which indexes in some way your frustrations with the capacity to talk about this in ways that you're happy with. And it goes like this, that in a book that drives me nuts, George Steiner's Real Presences, he says at a certain point, the only real interpretation of a work of art is another work of art. So the only real interpretation of Beethoven's Ninth is another symphony, et cetera, et cetera. All the words that pile up around these things are, modest, partial, inevitably limited simulacra of what we really need to talk about. So I guess my question is that where you're going with your frustration about this, or are you looking for a discursive mode that would be superior to those we practice on texts we write about that would do this better?
I'm looking for a discursive mode, not for a work of art, but not superior to what we practice on text. One that is sensitive to the discursive qualities of images or objects which speak, famous word, or communicate or enunciate in different ways from the ways the texts. That's one of our difficulties, to construct a semiotics, or whatever you want to call it, that is not the same kind that we use. I mean, art history made a great error in the 1980s when it brought fully into French-style semiotics. And the error was that that's a semiotics which is deeply linguistic, it's deeply concerned with language. But objects are not linguistic. We have no discursive model, for example, even thinking about interior space and exterior space, but thinking about miniatures and larges and walking around, being contained in the building or in the work of art or an object and holding an object. Those differences are real. I mean, we know them. We experience them all the time. But we don't actually have any kind of sophisticated language for discussing them, although we have a series of sophisticated languages for discussing textual semiotics. So that's what I would be more calling. And not just in religion, but definitely in religion.
I think on that note, we better end this conversation and move away and thank Professor Elsner.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.